Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today.
Hi, Kika.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I'm super excited to have you here today. Everyone, this is Kika Dorsey, and she's a poet, and she has several books of poetry published, but she also just, I don't know, when did you release as Joan Approaches?
2023, just last summer.
Okay, it was just last year. Then I wasn't sure how long ago that was, but sort of a new release as Joan Approaches Infinity, and that was your first published full-length novel, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, do you want to start us at the beginning of your author career, or do you want to jump in with Joan?
No, I'll give you kind of an overview. So basically, I've always considered myself a poet. I've been writing poetry since I've been young, since I've been a kid, really. And when I was getting my Ph.D. in Seattle, I was writing poetry at the same time and then studying a lot of the romantics and postmodern poetry, German and Italian poetry. And I wrote poetry, but I performed it. I worked with musicians and it was all spoken word. So I wasn't writing for the page. And then when I moved to Colorado and kind of settled down, I started writing more for the page. And that's resulted in 4 books of poetry. Oh. And my next book is being published. It's called Good Ash in December.
Ooh.
So yeah, so poetry has been my thing. But I was writing a book of poetry called Occupied. Vienna is a Broken Man and Daughter of Hunger when my mother was, declining with Alzheimer's and I was managing her care. And then she died and I wrote kind of in the wake of her death. She had been Austrian and grew up in post-war Austria and suffered a lot of hunger. And so I resurrected her stories and also researched them. And I was writing this book and it's very dark. This book is very dark. And it's my most successful book. I won the Colorado Authors League Award for it. But while I was writing that, I needed levity and I needed to also find a way of venting my frustration with aspects of my own life. So I was writing these short stories about this character, Joan, who's this flawed person. She's kind of like my alter ego. She does everything that I wanted to do in my frustration. And it's a feminist book, I think. And I was just writing short stories. And then I was taking these workshops with Sarah Elizabeth Shantz, who is one of my mentors really as a writer. And she said, Kika, you have a novel here. You got to turn this into a novel. So that's what I eventually did. It required a lot of revision. It required having a timeline. It required new chapters. But it really did start out as just me exploring short stories as a way to vent.
Yeah, sometimes I feel as authors, that's a good way to spur us to whatever topic or whatever new novel or whatever new piece, whether it's poetry or a short stories. And that can lead to good things because when they come out of something and I think a lot of times they tell you, right, what you know, I think you have more passion or more angst or whatever, and that comes through in the writing and people can really relate to that.
Yeah, I tend to write what I know. I tend to use my own life and then exaggerate. There's also tons of just absolute made up fiction. Like I've never done skydived. I've never, done a lot of the things that Joan does. And so that required some research. But yeah, one of the things that I watched this, I think it was called Mike and Molly or something. It's like a sitcom, and Susan Sarandon plays an author in it. And she gives Molly advice, and she said, don't let them tell you to write what you know. You got to write what you don't want other people to know. And I thought that was so funny. I'm like, yeah, those are the brave writers, right? when I teach creative writing, I'm like, I give them title, like these ideas of how to title their nonfiction. And one of them is you can title something about something that you do not want to write about. And I said, well, but if you write about it, you're brave, right?
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say it could be entitled, I'm not writing about X, right?
Yeah.
I'm not writing about my life.
And then writing about it.
And I'm not writing about my life, right? Well, yeah, I read the book. I read it in one plane flight. Well, I read it all except for like the last chapter in one like 2 hour plane flight. I just absorbed it and I loved every minute of it. I have to say, like I mean, you were saying, I think you were talking about some of your short stories being darker. And you told me, I think when you gave me this book that, oh, and thank you very much, by the way, I passed it on to my mother-in-law, who I think will really enjoy it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, and you said to me, I don't think you'll like it. It's kind of a dark comedy, it's satire, and I'm thinking, Kika, don't tell someone that. I love the book.
Well, I was insecure because, you're writing within a genre and actually I do have reactions of people who really don't like this book. They
Well,
think
yeah, I think you
they
have to
don't like Joan. Like my sister doesn't like the book.
Well,
Like they just
I
don't
don't
like Joan.
think you're supposed to like her 100%,
No,
right?
no,
supposed to
she's
make
so
you
flawed.
right.
She's
She's supposed
a
to make you
narcissist.
think about what you could be, because like literally, I mean, I was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years. I had 3 kids. My husband worked long hours. I was alone with them much of the time. I was sole caregiver. I was doing all the chores. I was cleaning the house. I was getting the groceries, cooking all the food. And you were so like locked into this little small world that sometimes you start feeling like, I need something else. I need a release. And that is what Joan, I feel like, is looking for, right? She's looking for something that's her own, that only she gets. And and it is like, an exaggerated view maybe of what someone could do. But had I thought about having a drink every night? Oh, yes. Like had I thought about using something to just take the edge off this, long stint of playing Uno 1,000 times. So, I mean, in that way, and it was kind of jarring when I first started reading it because I do usually read prose that are longer. But then as I got into the first chapter, I was like, this is the perfect way to write this book because it's just very matter of fact. You have this third person point of view looking out from the inside, which tell me about that choice too.
Well, and the novel I'm writing now is also third person limited omniscient. The reason I chose that with Joan is I wanted some voice that transcends her own thoughts. Although I do admit that the book as Joan approaches infinity could have been first person. But I wanted to distance myself from her, I think partly, so that was partly the choice of third person limited. I prefer third person limited as a point of view because I feel like you can also do more with setting and with the externalities of their reality. But that being said, this third person point of view and limited omniscience is so unreliable, just like first person. And I could have easily done that. The novel I'm writing now needs to be third person limited omniscient because I'm talking about the time period that I'm writing in, and I'm having an omniscient moments opening chapters. Yeah.
Neat. Well, I like the third person because it really did feel like you were somebody like peeking in her window, maybe that shouldn't be peeking in her window and seeing things that she didn't want her neighbors, her friends, her family to see about her life. But you were seeing it, and that was kind of risque in and of itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I love Joan's story. And I mean, have you read the book, Where'd You Go, Bernadette?
No, I've heard of it though.
Okay, yeah, so that's what really this book reminds me of, because in that book, it's a very like exaggerated woman who ends up she's in a fight with her neighbor about the landscaping. She's ignoring her daughter. She's ignoring her husband. And a little bit of that book does kind of cut to the daughter's point of view for a while too. But yeah, I mean, I think they're making a movie out of it, but I love the book, so I don't know if I want to watch the movie. But I think it's, who is the lady that played in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts. I think that's going to be she's going to be the star of that. But anyway, I thought it was a wonderful book, and so kudos to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I wanted to also, third person is better when you're writing satire. And there is a satirical element to this novel, which I feel has been misunderstood by some people because you relate to Joan so much, even though you don't want to, right?
Right,
But
definitely.
also making a comment of society that gets maybe lost in how close, because you're so close to the character. But Joan really is very invisible in a way, she's taken for granted by her family. Her husband, even though she runs the whole household, her husband thinks she should be out there making money, which is that second wave of feminism where it's like, okay, women can go out and have a career now, but you're still supposed to also raise the kids, get dinner on the table, clean the house, take care of the bills. You know what I mean? So she's really stuck in a way. So I intended to have commentary on that sort of the dark side of the second wave of feminism, that actually women could leave the home and enter the workplace, but then we don't have universal childcare. You'd have to pay for daycare. You'd have to be a woman making a really good salary if you're going to, afford a house cleaner and daycare. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And I thought I definitely picked up on that and her feeling of being stuck. And also it was interesting, the husband's character and what he allowed her to do, and wondering if that was sort of his admission that he knew that she was sort of in that situation. So he wasn't going to fight her on some of these other things or he wasn't going to rebuke her for some of her actions, and he wasn't going to blame her. He wasn't going to, yell or kick her out or any of these crazy things she ends up doing. He's just gonna take it and he's gonna let it go so that she stays there and their life still looks the same, right?
Well, he's very tolerant of her. He puts
Right.
up with her, but at the same time, he's not supportive of her. There's not this sense that it's a healthy, loving marriage necessarily. She tries to talk herself into believing it is, but he's so obsessed with his own world. He doesn't seem to try to understand her. He tolerates her, but he doesn't seem to try to understand her.
Right. That's the feeling I got.
And she's very alone,
Yeah, it did feel that way, very lonely. And she lost her mother, and I don't think that's a spoiler. It kind of happens early in the book, but I'm not going to give away and it's so funny. I was reading the book and the whole time I was like, how is she going to end this? How is she going to end this? And it was the perfect ending. So I thought you did.
I decided to go over the top.
Definitely. But it fit her. It was totally fitting. And yeah, I loved it. 100%. So in your poetry, when you write poems and you publish them as a book, does it have a theme to each book? You write like a certain type of theme, or do you have things that are just like from different themes and different ideas published in one work?
I end up having themes, like now the publishing world of poetry really does expect to have a certain arc or theme or consistency. That wasn't the case in the past. In the past, books of poetry were often collections of poetry, but publishers are looking for themes more. My book of poetry, the chapbook Beside Herself, was about raising young children. It was my first book published, and it was when my children were young. Rust, my first full-length collection, was, dealing with my mother who had Alzheimer's, and and I have a lot of surreal poems. Coming Up for Air didn't really have a theme, and that's why I think it's not as successful. It's not my favorite of my books. And then Vienna is a Broken Man was completely thematic. I mean, the whole first half of it, I create fictional characters based on my research and my mother's stories about post-war Austria, mostly from the point of view of mothers and children and their experience through that rubble of World War II, you know. And then the second half is about dealing with my mother who had Alzheimer's and her death and my legacy. So it was her legacy and my legacy. And then this book, Good Ash, that I'm publishing in December, it's got a pretty metaphysical, thematical sort of focus. You know, it's about, I would say it's got a romantic quality to it. It's about the liminal sort of boundary between both self and other, and it's pretty surreal at moments. So I would say it's philosophical, Good Ash. It's a way of, you know, transcending these notions that we need to see death as something to escape instead of something that we integrate in every moment that dies in our lives. You know, it's like, it's trying to create a metaphysics that is hard for me to describe except through poetry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good Ash seemed to be talking about maybe, you know, the afterlife or however people believe about what comes next. But in a more, maybe a positive way. Or it was funny because I was
Yeah.
just talking with a friend about this last week. She was like, yeah, so many people are so scared. I mean, whether you believe in a Christian way or just there is an afterlife or whatever you believe, like you can, I mean, obviously you can't will yourself to believe something that you don't really believe, but you know, she was like, everybody's so scared of this, but I know there's something better. And she's like, it's just so sad that I see people so scared. And her husband's a doctor, so he sees it a lot of the time. But yeah, no, it was kind of freeing for me to think of it. I mean, I do believe there's something after, but it's hard when you're so limited and maybe you don't. I mean, some people say they hear or get signs from their lost loved ones all the time, and that hasn't really been my experience. So then I'm like, well, you know, why am I not getting these signs? But I'm gonna keep believing. So yeah.
I was talking to my son this morning. My son is a scientist, so is my daughter, you know, and my son is very rational and very cynical about everything I believe in. And I basically told him, I believe in everything. I believe in the tarot. I believe in the afterlife. I believe in astrology. I've chosen to embrace everything because I think everything is just a symbolic expression of the movement of the universe, and that there's truth, especially in ancient traditions and ancient philosophies. And I do believe the planets influence us. I believe everything. And my son is the complete opposite. He doesn't believe in anything. He believes in science, in rationality, like rationality. He's like the epitome of, you know, the age of enlightenment, you know, of, you know, reason and rationality, which is very important, right? We need that. But the problem is that's the kind of thing that ends up having the toppling of the French Revolution, right? If we believe that rationality is that leads to control, it leads to the destruction of the environment. And that's why the Romanticists came and said, okay, we need to embrace the irrational and emotion and these complexities that the rational cannot explain.
Right. Well, that's interesting that you say that. I think probably more as a young adult, and my background is science too. I probably believe that way more too. But as I've grown and had more experiences, I feel like my openness has grown too, and I've seen so much more. So I don't know, maybe he won't develop that, but maybe, you know, maybe he will. So
well, and also you're a writer and you use your imagination. Your imagination is already define any kind of like rational control over an environment, right? Because you're dealing with reverie. It's amazing that consciousness can contain this reverie and imagination. You know, that's magical in itself.
I believe it is. That's why my podcast is called Finding the Magic. So you're
Oh
right.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us what's going to be next for you.
Well, I am writing, well, I wrote a draft. You know, it dawned on me, I wrote this draft in 1 year, and I didn't think I was even writing much because I was teaching full time at CU, but I guess I was writing enough. It's another short novel. It's going to be a little over 200 pages. But it's over 50,000 words, so it is a novel. And it's about a character, Joan, who's 10 years old, who grows up in West Lawn in Chicago. I'm from the Midwest originally, spent a lot of time in Chicago. And West Lawn is near Midway Airport. And it's in the 70s, it was very Catholic and Irish Catholic. So she grows up in that neighborhood, and her father has schizoaffective disorder. He's mentally ill. At the time, they called it paranoid schizophrenia. And her mother's an Austrian immigrant. So those things are actually based on my experience. My mother was an Austrian immigrant. My father, at the time, it was called paranoid schizophrenia. Now they call it bipolar with schizoaffective disorder, which made for a pretty rotten childhood.
I'm going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm having Joan as a 10-year-old navigate that family and the turbulence of it. And at the same time, she's going through puberty. So she's really precocious. She's pretty philosophical for a 10-year-old, 10 and 11. She turns 11. Takes place in 1975 and 1976. So I'm doing a lot of research at that time period. I've lived it, but I don't remember it that well, so I have to look back. Yeah, so I wrote that book, and now I need beta readers, which you said you might do, right?
I will do, definitely do.
Oh, good. But first I need to go to Chicago and fill out the setting. I just need to get my eyes on that neighborhood.
Yeah, that seems like it would be an important piece to just put her completely in the setting. But did you say the character's name was Joan? Just like
it is Joan. It's the same character.
Oh, they're the same character.
Yeah,
okay.
it's a prequel.
Almost a prequel, right? Okay.
It's a prequel. It's a prequel. And I did have one reader, and he said this totally works for Joan. Like, it fits in what you start understanding why Joan becomes the adult she is if you read her experience as a child.
Yeah, and then it would be interesting to fill in that time teenage college young, why does she fall in love with the person she marries? And
maybe I'll just keep writing Joan books.
Just keep going.
wasn't it Ellen Gilchrist? She wrote all those Rhoda books, all the Rhoda short stories.
No, I don't know.
She wrote a bunch of, she just chose a character and just kept writing this character.
Well, and I guess I do in a way in my fantasy, they're fantasy characters, but yeah, I'm on my fourth novel, first person protagonist. She's a fairy queen, but yeah, I can't let her go. Like, I want to bring her through all these stages. Yeah, it's definitely coming of age. She's very young in the beginning, and and 4 or 5 years later, where is she now? So
but it's nice because as a writer, one of the things we always want to do is we want to develop complex characters. And the more we actually know and understand and create experiences for our characters, the better our writing becomes. So I think it's actually really good to kind of continue with a character because you get more dimension.
Right. Well, I think in any book, I had this idea for my next romance book, and I was trying to flesh out the characters, but I really have to think a long time about what was their childhood like, what was their family life like, what experiences did they have in elementary, high school, college, and why is their personality this way? Why do they have these hang-ups? Why do they have these issues? And so I have to flush all that out before I even first write, the first page, because you have to have your characters set, and how are they going to overcome if they need to overcome, or how are they going to make decisions based on their past history and all those things. So yeah, it has to be kind of at least mostly fleshed out, right?
I have my students, one of their exercises that I do sometimes is they write up a bunch of questions for their partner, in the class. about the main character, and then they interview back and forth. So that's one of the activities I do. I said, just like, and so like all of a sudden you have a character in a short story and you have to answer what their favorite fruit is, right? Like, and I asked them to do interesting questions like that would reveal something about those characters' personality.
Interesting. That's a good, yeah, maybe I'll have to use that in my new writing scheme of interviewing every character
Yeah.
to flesh them out. So when are you taking your trip to Chicago?
A week from tomorrow. So
Okay. And how
yeah.
long will you be there?
I'll only be there a week. I'm gonna stay with, I have a friend who lives in Pilsen, which is like the barrio, and I'll stay with her. And they're in the middle of a remodel, so it might be kind of crazy, but I'm gonna at least spend 2 full days in West Lawn. I'll take an Uber there, or my friend Gina will take me there. And I might help her out a little bit. And yeah, I've done everything in Chicago, but I might repeat the architecture tour just because it's so amazing. Like they have this boat tour on the Chicago River that goes into Lake Michigan, and it's so fascinating. I love Chicago. I love the architecture. And the father, Joan's father in my novel is an architect
Oh, okay.
who can't work anymore because of his
Because,
mental illness. And
interesting.
he also is creating some crazy designs, but he is an architect. So studying the architect of Chicago, because he gives he gives her, speeches about the architecture
Okay.
of Chicago.
Interesting. So yeah, you would have to do a lot of research for those, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been to Chicago several times. I haven't taken the boat tour. I've always wanted to do that. So maybe I should put that on my
You
list.
should. It's fascinating. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was just realizing that you made Joan a professor too. Is she a literature professor too?
She's an adjunct. So she's not a professor. She's an
Okay.
adjunct instructor at a community college of composition.
Okay. I knew it was something related. I was trying to
Which is
remember.
something I did for years, and it's just insane. It's like you make so little money for the work that you do. I'm in a better position now. I'm a lecturer, so I'm not a full-time professor or associate professor, but I'm at CU and I get benefits, and I'm in a much better position now.
Fun. Well, yes, I loved meeting you. Kika and I met at, what is it called? It was called Springs Book Bash in Colorado Springs. I think it's like in April, right? So
Yeah.
that was a lot of fun. I was really excited to meet you. So I hope we can continue this. I definitely want to beta read your book. Do tell everyone listening where we can find your books.
Well, as Joan Approaches Infinity, you can find on Amazon. It was published by Gesture Press, which is a wonderful feminist press. Heather Goodrich was, awesome to publish this book for me, and she's been great to work with. And then my Good Ash and my Occupied, Vienna is a Broken Man, was published by Pinyon Publishing. And Susan Ensminger is the person behind that, who is also wonderful to work with, especially since Occupy came out during the pandemic and it was hard to, market. And she put a YouTube page with me reading poetry and set it to music. She was wonderful. So everything I've written, you can get on Amazon too.
Great. Well, and do you have your website as well?
Yeah, kikadorsey.com. It really needs to be updated and redone. I just haven't gotten to it. So it's not a very impressive website.
Well, I was going to say, as long as we can go to the website and click on your book, then we will be happy.
Yeah, you can do that. And and also I'm on Facebook. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for being here. And I will definitely have you back when your new book comes out.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.